Good morning. Welcome, everybody. My name is Eleanor Kelly. I am part of the Convene team here at UCD Innovation Academy. And today we will be exploring creativity and innovation in education with our inaugural cohort of Convene Fellows. Convene is a collaboration between UCD Innovation Academy and TU Dublin. It is made possible by the Higher Education Authority and the Human Capital Initiative. And as part of Convene, we are transforming how higher education and enterprise work together. And part of that mission, Convene is exploring new methods of teaching and delivery in education. So at UCD Innovation Academy, we've had 11 Convene Innovation Fellows from across 11 different schools, everything from music to law to food science, nursing and more. And all of them have pursued the themes of creativity and innovation in different ways through their fellowships over the past months. You can read more about the fellowships in depth in articles that we've just published on our website, the Innovation Academy website, and I'm sure you will get a flavour of their work today. TU Dublin, our partners in Convene, they have their own fellows as well, and I'm delighted that some of them are listening in today, and we will hear from one of the TU Convene fellows later. Now, we do want you to get involved. We do want you to participate, so please leave your questions, comments in the chat, and I'll come back to them at about 20 to the hour when we hope to have some good discussion and interaction over your questions. But first, let me hand it over to Professor Suzi Jarvis, Founding Director of UCD Innovation Academy, who will chair the discussion today. Suzi.
Thank you, Eleanor. Welcome, everybody. Well, I think this will be a more authentic and hopefully more interesting conversation if we take a moment to relax. So I'm going to take us to the grassy banks of the UCD Lake on a warm summer's day, sitting outside, the smell of freshly cut grass, surrounded by groups of our students and colleagues and friends. Are we there yet? Are you sitting comfortably? Okay, then I'll begin. I'll begin where the first nascent seeds of your fellowships began, back in November 2019 at the Future Jobs Island Summit. And there was a presentation by Sadia Zahedi from the World Economic Forum. She proposed that by 2022, everyone would need an extra 101 days of learning to prepare for the future of work. With innovation, learning strategies and creativity identified as the top 3 skills for future preparedness. In part, the HEA Human Capital Initiative was a recognition that higher education in Ireland would play a key role in providing these learning opportunities for our citizens. Yet most of us academics have not been recruited for our creativity, learning strategies, or innovation. And so the idea of the 101 days of the Innovation Fellowship was born. So here we are today on the other side of your 101 days, to hear about your reflections and learning. So, Deirdre, in your role in the School of Education, obviously you're thinking about the wider education system and creativity. What have you learned through your fellowship that you'd like to share with us?
Hi, Suzi, thanks so much. Yeah, I suppose my background is in primary education, and I've worked across primary, early childhood and post-primary education in preparing educators. And, you know, I suppose I'll draw on a quote from Albert Einstein, which is, "It is the supreme art of the teacher to awaken joy in creative expression and knowledge." And I think that's really important. I think, you know, that it is the role of the teacher in a classroom or in a lecture theatre to stand up and, you know, really express joy in the knowledge, but also awaken joy in our students' engagement in creativity as well. So I suppose what I've learned over the course of my fellowship is the importance of awakening that creativity and that creative spirit. And I've also learned that it's really important that as educators, we have agency to be able to do that, because without agency, you know, we can't engage in that creative endeavor. So I think that's a really important aspect. And I think the fellowship for me has given me time to be a creative agent and to explore creativity and the importance of creativity in my work. And also I think as well, it has allowed me just to step back and think about myself and my own well-being, because for me, creativity and well-being are inextricably linked. And I think, it's really important that we nurture our well-being within the education system in order to allow ourselves the freedom and the vulnerability and the risk-taking and everything that's really important when we are trying to be creative agents, to be able to engage in that creative process as well. And fundamentally for me, teaching is a creative endeavor, whether you're teaching in a primary classroom, if you're teaching in early years, or you're teaching in a lecture theatre, what we are engaged in with our students, with our children, with our young people is a creative endeavor together as community. So I think that's really been some of the key learning for me from my fellowship.
Beautiful, thank you, Deirdre. Jo, I know you've been exploring meeting many educators in different contexts. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing during your fellowship.
Yeah, I mean, riffing off Dee's kind of quote from Einstein. When I first walked in, the first day I walked into the Innovation Academy at the Shack, Alan Morgan, who was kind of leading the program, has kind of reflected on it a few times. I always carry a camera with me. And there's a lovely quote from Ansel Adams, who is a great black and white photographer of the American kind of national parks and stuff. And he says, you don't take a photograph, you make a photograph. And you bring to the act of making a photograph all the people you've loved, all the music you've heard, all the books you've read. And for me, the Innovation Academy Fellowship was a space, and it's going to go on a lot longer than 101 days, Suzi. You've got something to answer for here. It was a space to reconnect, I think, and connect with new people. The fellows on the call today, but educators all around the world. So I started a podcast, which I'd always wanted to do, and have interviewed about 20 different educators from around the world, some from the Innovation Academy, but others from wider afield, and had some super experiences, learnt a huge amount, started work. I've got papers in progress. I've got a book in progress at the moment now. So one of the things that the fellowship, and I know it's not me, you'll hear this from a lot of other of the fellows today as well, is it's built networks, it's built connection. I knew Dee before we got onto this fellowship, but I didn't know her as well as I know her now, and the same goes for Jacob and for Kath and Eleanor and old JC and the others. So I mean, it's created bonds, and those bonds I think will endure and will continue, forward past the fellowship space, and will inform our professional and our personal lives and the way we move forward as educators. I've learned a huge amount from connecting with other innovative entrepreneurial educators and just being open to hearing how they do things and how they do things, that I would never even considered doing. But then there's maybe a little spark, or there's a connection made, or there's an aha moment. And I suspect we've all had aha moments with the stuff that we've been exposed to over the last few months. I certainly have. So thank you so much, because, if we don't get a chance to say that, I'd like to say thank you for the fellowship. It's been an amazing experience for me.
Thank you, Jo. So I know connection and networking has been a very important part of the fellowship for many people. Kate, would you maybe like to talk a little bit about how you've been looking at the outside world and bringing that in as an experience for your students?
Thank you very much, Suzi. And I suppose, as both what Dee and Jo has said, it's that piece of looking out and bringing it back in. And for me, the fellowship allowed me the time to do that, and the collaborations. I have just found the networking. I find a lot of what I don't know, continuing. There's so much I don't know, and I'm happy to say that. and actually the positivity and sharing of so many other people. So I suppose one of the things for me was I'm in the School of Nursing and kind of connecting out through the areas of public health. And where I've connected out to are forming other networks and other collaborations, both within the UK and Ireland around smoke-free homes. That's one. So again, that was just sparking conversations, bringing what I was listening to in the classroom, the experiences of students, and also acknowledging sort of like from my own research, bringing that in. And then connecting with other people and acknowledging how to look at that space and to think, how can we improve things for people? And fortunately, sort of like bringing another fellow with me in Dee, and actually acknowledging that when we look at smoke-free homes, or when we look at actually supporting people to quit smoking or to reduce the exposure to secondhand smoke in the home, it takes a village to actually support people. It's not one person or alone to do that. And it's actually acknowledging what is needed, the innovation and the creativity to really think about the person and to think about the people and to think actually what a home is and what that means to people. So again, that was all sparking from my teaching and from my own experiences and bringing that through. So that was one network. And another network, I suppose, that I kind of am really looking forward to, that has started through the Innovation Academy and through this fellowship, is actually linking through the Health Research Exchange, which really is an international network. And that provides the opportunity for early career researchers and doctoral students to connect in. And that was formed through a platform that was developed by Dr. Negin Filadi and Professor Mark Exworthy in the University of Birmingham, and Negin is in the University of Maryland. And really actually with COVID, looking through the U21 network and actually developing that up and seeing where opportunities exist for students, who, especially doctoral students and early career researchers, who the kind of transforming education, how we communicate and how we support students to be able to disseminate and to think. And when as we've learned, all of us have learned through the Innovation Academy and what we read, the skills for the next generation, where they come from, that creativity, that sparking, as we've said, through one another in a non-competitive way, through a really supportive network and encouraging others. And I suppose for me, what I am gaining and learning and thriving on through the Innovation Academy and through meeting with all the other fellows and yourselves, that I want to actually provide that space for others as well, and actually to experience some of it, because I think what I have gained has just been transformational, and I really welcome what I have got, and I'm happy to share that with others. And as you say, as Joe said, the 101 days, I don't think so. As I said, this is for life.
Great, thank you, Kate. You've used a couple of phrases there that I would say are quite challenging in academia. You use the phrase not knowing, and it's not one person. Whereas I think academia, we kind of often imagine academics as the sage on the stage, the person who does have all the answers, and probably finds it more difficult to step back into that vulnerable beginner space. But actually it's a really important space if we want to take risks and do something different. JC, I know you've been looking at possible changes in your school. Could you tell us a little bit about your reflections on the fellowship?
Yeah, I'm well, to come back from Joe, I'd never got the chance to pass the threshold of the academy. I experienced the academy through online only in May 2020. Seems like an age ago, pre or during the pandemic. This is, I know we're in the happy place of the lake. We're surrounded by friends today, but we're still in the middle of it. I think, yeah, that was the main learning for me, was to acknowledge that if you want students to engage with you in a class, in a creative environment, you need to step down from that stage that you talked about, Suzi, the sage on the stage. We cannot be all-knowing if we want the students to be learning in a way, and actively learning and creative creatively learning. So that was, for me, the initial spark, was to stop bombarding students with even creative and multimedia notes and documents and tools to learn, but to let them bring their own creativity, their own initiative, so they learn by themselves and for themselves, not for the test. That was one big thing. And then you can apply that to a theater with 300 students. If you have the guts, you can bring that to a smaller classroom. You can bring that to your postgrad. At each stage, I think it's a change of optic and change of way of teaching and way of engaging with the students. But to chime with Deirdre, the stage and the sage on the stage has a role that everybody understands, and there is a protection, physical and for mental well-being of being the sage. If you allow yourself to not know, and if you allow students to question what you don't know, then mental well-being is not a given, and you need to recharge an awful lot more than you would in a normal teaching setting. So that takes a lot of energy, mental energy, and certainly online, that's maybe doubled or tripled, and that takes a lot of time. That was another aspect to that.
Thank you, JC. So if it's not sage on the stage, is it guide on the side? Is it meddler in the middle? Jacob, what are your thoughts? If you're on mute at the moment.
Yeah, you just missed me saying. So I'm thinking about something that rhymes with Joker. So yeah, I think for me, playfulness and the notion of taking my craft seriously, but not myself seriously, has been, because it keeps growing, a big part of how I approach teaching. The module that it's my newest module, and it's the one that is most reflecting that, is creative problem solving, which I teach in the Smurfit Graduate School of Business. It's a summer elective. And it's probably one of the most mad and experimental modules at UCD. I don't think there are many modules where accounting students and serious masters in management students get up and start passing imaginary balls in the air, or bring a collage they did, which really freaked them out. And kind of zooming out of the fellowship a little bit back to when, because I was one of the lucky ones to do the certificate and diploma live, and the certificate ended and my diploma started just as I was designing my first creative problem solving module, and it really connected well, and I took and adapted various physical elements from there. So I think being a skillful improviser, for me, and I don't think it applies to everyone, is something that really resonates, because when you have certainty, you can be an expert, because you can plan, you can predict. We all say VUCA, 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 but really when you have a world that is changing fast, what you want is not a set of knowables, but a certain attitude that allows people to be flexible. And if I don't model that, how can I expect my students to do that? And for me, the fellowship had to do a lot with refreshing myself, reflecting, inspiration, and connection. And one of the ways to really, for me, get inspired and to refresh myself is to travel, which actually, so I was able to combine work with traveling, and I'm now in Chile, lovely Chile town in higher plains in Sri Lanka. And the way I travel is the way I approach teaching is I have some goals, but I allow the terrain to surprise me. Otherwise, it all becomes a bit too pre-planned, too boring, too expected. So that's kind of a living metaphor for me. In terms of the reflecting and connecting and inspiring. So I was thinking today about the symposium, and I realized that beyond the value of what that extra time of not being super busy allowed me to do, there has been a symbolic value for those fellowships. Because, you know, we all keep hearing the keywords, the buzzwords. Teaching is also important. It's not just research. University is not just research. But there is very little operationalization of that. There's very little actual resources dedicated to convince academics that this is true. And this is not just at UCD, this is in most universities. So such a fellowship, and it's in my almost 20 years in UCD, it's the first one that is system one major fellowship that says teaching is important. Investing in your teaching, Mr. Academic, is important for us. And we are going to invest in you by putting those seeds in the ground and trusting you to grow them into something that will give fruits to your students and therefore to the wider society. So for me, it was a really empowering, symbolic effect, that fellowship. And not just that, it's not just about good teaching, it's about risk-taking. And I think Deidre mentioned that. So it's about saying, look, you're doing crazy stuff, but we believe in you. We know that the crazy stuff will not always work. And it would be horrible if it always worked, because it would mean that we're all the time in a safe zone. If everything, most of what I do works, I have to say, but it's like with cooking, 90% works well when I improvise, but then there's the 10% of things, I overdid it here and there. If it always worked, it wouldn't be experimentation, it wouldn't be risk-taking. But we play it safe as professionals. So such a fellowship says, not just teaching important, but taking risks in your teaching is important. So for me, that was really empowering. And what it also allowed me is to do two things with the time: to invest in my own ideas or ideas that came up and try and promote them into reality. But it also allowed me to do something that is very congruent with the way I want to live my life. And it is to contribute to colleagues in ways where, you know, even in projects where I'm not the focal point. So I never would have imagined that I would be part of a team working on veterinary medicine topics. And as it happened, Sandra, who knew she's one of the fellows. She learned I have a background in social and organizational psychology. She's doing trying to do a wonderful project to do with training veterinary nurses, connected with me, and I ended up providing her with some ideas and materials on promoting self-efficacy among nursing students. I would never have thought. So this is kind of the interesting connections that happened. It allowed me to really progress and invest in a book I'm co-editing that is exactly about how the pandemic affected our teaching and learning, and it looks both at institutions, mostly at lecturers and teaching and learning, and also at students. And it's now, and it's kind of the final stages, has all kind of chapters that talk about reactions and adaptation to this new vulnerable world. And we're creating a symposium for a major conference based on that. And then another thing, few things that happened with me thinking, okay, here are things that I've done. How can they be used for the greater good or in a bigger scope? And I'll finish with mentioning 2 projects that I'm leading student teams, because one of the things that clicked for me is that I want to make things happen, but I don't want to do them all myself. And Smurfit, what I realized, there is a wonderful vehicle for that. And it's a program that was created and directed by my colleague, Linda, who's actually about to finish, or just finished the program as well. So it's all connected. Global Leadership Program. We have about 500 students from Smurfit to participate. What the wonderful thing about this program is, students invest dozens of hours during the year for extracurricular projects. And they actually do not, I mean, they receive a little recognition, but it's not that. They invest extra time in a very busy year to do interesting stuff, to contribute, to engage in leadership. And for me, this is golden, because this is really part of education. It's not just the in-class experiences. So one project that I've started with them, which is rekindling a project that I was involved in a few years ago when I directed the MSc programs, is case study competition. So, and the unique part of it is it involves mixed teams of multiple different programs, and that will work on an actual case from industry that obviously will demand creative problem solving. So I'm the academic mentor for that. And the other project that's really close to my heart and was born out of me inviting guest speakers for my creative problem solving. And the guest speakers ranged from somebody who worked with rhyming, a poet who taught rhyming to corporates to help them present in a more creative way. And by the way, she really put me on my toes or heels in the class, because unexpectedly she invited me to introduce myself in rhyming, which was an interesting experience. And that get, we can actually, should we do it now? No, not now. Something like, my name is Jake, I'm not a fake, can I bake? Maybe not a cake. Anyway, that's and but the idea was to expose the Smurfit students to a much wider range of people who graduated from business school, and their careers are not only the traditional careers. So I have a wonderful team of students, very diverse, who are now organizing series of speakers in what's called creative and non-traditional careers after business school. And that will happen in semester 2. And I better shut up here and hear from some other wonderful fellows. So thanks.
Thank you, Jacob. So Jacob, you've been at UCD for nearly 20 years, I think you mentioned. Somebody who's moved to UCD more recently is Justin. So academic careers have probably changed a lot over the last 20 years. Certainly the expectations of universities and the number of people who expect to or aspire to go to university, both straight out of school and also as lifelong learners, has changed dramatically over those 20 years. So Justin, tell us a little bit about your fellowship and what you've been working on.
All right. So first of all, I liked Jacob's approach to teaching. I teach the way I travel. I take it relatively similar. I go somewhere and then we see what's going to be around there. And that's usually fairly refreshing. And I think the students appreciate it. But in the same sense, I also object to these almost stigmatizing notions as, you know, a sage on a stage. I just don't like them because they don't really reflect the, as you said, the variety, but also the multiple facets of the teaching, researching, administration profession that we're more or less engaged in. This is what we're doing here as academics. We don't only teach, but more than 70% is actually research and administration. And I've quite honestly never been to an academic conference where anybody told me from junior or senior staff, I know everything, either in teaching, research, or anything for that purpose. But maybe this is just the modesty of lawyers, as it often is. So this is more or less how I approached the project. I walked around in my network virtually and over the last couple of weeks and 1 or 2 months also physically, just to talk to people and see what they think. I talked to people from just by coincidence, really by chance, in a rerouted flight. I met the senior counsel of Netflix, who I knew via 4 or 5 connections, and I told I'm developing a module in law and policy in the digital realm, and had a good exchange with her. And what more or less transpired was that when it comes to creativity and certainly legal teaching, and we feed students into a regulated profession, is that most people see there is really not much room for creativity because the curricula are so constrained. So we really have to find creativity. We find not necessarily creativity, but different approaches in certain nooks and crannies of the curriculum. And we also have to hide it fairly well, that it doesn't seem we're doing something esoterical or something that is would be considered to be inappropriate for students, because not so much as a sage on the stage, but we always perceived as not necessarily role models, but we're being perceived as somebody with experience, somebody who also takes education very, very seriously. And this is in the end what we're being paid for. And this is the conversation I had with people from the industry, at least in my area, from academia and from the public policy sector. So I'm trying to tease out from them what they would think would be important to teach to students in general, aside from the project what I was developing, what would provide them with good skills as lawyers, but also legally educated individuals who work in other professions. And nobody could really give me a proper answer, and nobody for that purpose could even tell me how I should teach something that wasn't already contained in the legal curriculum, simply because it would be very, very unusual. And their gut feeling, there was no empirical evidence, their gut feeling was always a student probably wouldn't really like it, but this might be one part of the legal education that is very, very peculiar. And I also talked to people who tried different academic or education approaches to teaching the law. I talked to a good friend of mine, the University of East Anglia, who developed a board game approach to teaching copyright, and asked her whether it was worthwhile doing. She had a lot of fun, but what one also has to consider is the output, the outcomes, the efficiency of the teaching approach. Of course, couldn't be measured, but she also thought she probably invested a bit too much time into doing this. So whilst I was trying to find something that could teach something new to students and add something to the education, I also thought not only my time must be well spent, but also their time must be well spent. I don't want to have a class where students play board games for 12 sessions, but I want them to have something that really comes out of it. So it's about the process, but also about the outcome. But what I appreciate most was to get, because I fully realize I know fairly little in the larger scheme of things, was this reaffirmation by other colleagues to say, number one, you don't know anything. Number two, we don't know anything. And the echo was always, the good approach is always, your students probably know far less than you do. And there's really a bit of an intellectual vacuum you can play around with. As long as you provide a good narrative, as long as you don't want to call it a facade, but if you have a good packaging, and the good packaging in my case will really be to make sure that I don't teach myself mainly, I let the students do it, but also, and this is the current advantage of the digital environment, I will let others teach them to lend more credibility to a flexible approach. Because if I think that if I can invite people from Google, Netflix, Facebook, and whatnot, and leading academics from around the world to a course, it can't really be this bad. So if you talk about junior academics and the things that they struggle with, certainly in education, and there are many cases where Sadly, specifically female younger academics are not being taken seriously. I get my credibility by buying in people that have much more credibility. But in this way, we also form kind of like a community of people who can exchange, because surprisingly, they are interested in what our students have to say. If not to get an argument against their position, if you have a fundamentally copyright leftist and unleash them against the capitalist infrastructure that you find in Google public policy, it is fun to watch as an academic. And both sides might argue, but they will still get something out of it. So there are a number of elements that that are still playing in my mind, that are still kind of like in a constant phase of development. That hopefully in the end will make, in my case, a model that is fairly interesting for students. But the students will also have to understand that there is something in them other than a new teaching methodology that is fun and that is at least partially crazy. It's really about selling them a good product that they will accept. And I'm fully aware that in other areas of academia, it might be easier. In law, we always struggle with this notion of creativity, but it's really about finding these in unusual places, in places where we didn't expect it, or hiding it so that our students are exposed to them without really noticing it.
Great, thank you, Justin. So Michaela's just joined us. Michaela, we're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. And I know that you've been pursuing astronauts as part of your fellowship. So could you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and what you've learned? You're on mute. Not able to join us at the moment. Michaela, can you hear us? Oh, 5 minutes. Okay. All right. We'll have to hear about the astronauts later on. Okay. So if we start thinking about the wider education system, I know we've had some conversations, particularly around things like assessment, that are maybe harder to change on the individual level. But JC, I know you've been thinking about trying to move away from terminal exams, or at least change the style of them. Tell us a little bit about your thinking around assessment and what impact that has on student learning.
Yeah, maybe it's the kind of students we get in food and agriculture. I don't think so, though. I think it's more general than that. There is a sense nowadays that students learn for a grade. They expect a grade in September starting, and it can be very disruptive in their learning, because all they do is spend time to not to learn and not to be creative, not to be understanding the subject, but just to know enough to have the grade that they expect they have in their heads starting off. So I did something maybe quite disruptive to an online class of master's students this term, and I told them that they passed already. That was my first intervention to them, to tell them that they've passed. And so now that the shackles were broken, as it were, of learning for the test, because they have passed, let's have some fun. And I see there's another question corollary to that, is that, are we allowed to take risk? Are the students allowing themselves to take risk? And I think if you give them the freedom to take risk, if you tell them, well, as long as you come with me on that journey for the next 12 weeks of term, you passed. Therefore, all you do now is have some fun with maybe the Joker or the clown, to echo Jacob, or but we're going to have some fun, and so the learning becomes different and the assessment becomes different, because you don't need to assess them for a passing grade. You need to assess them for as a reflection. So what I introduced then was a multimedia project that they researched on a specific topic in food science, that they researched themselves with a guided research, and that they through peer scholar assessed themselves. So they assessed each other's, as it were, and learned from one another how they approached the assessment. And reflections I had from those students, so they are mature students, master students, they all have graduated from a primary degree. For a majority of them, it was the first time that they actually viewed somebody else's essay or assessment. So they learned from one another, from giving advice more than from getting feedback. So that was unexpected for me. And I'll continue that, and trying to kind of give them, I think, originally give the students a safe space, so where they are allowed experiment with their learning, experiment with the assessment, etc.
Great, thank you, JC. And I can see Eleanor's joined us again. So Eleanor, are you going to lead the question and answer session?
I am. Thanks, Suzi. For our first question, we'll invite Dr. Graham O'Neill, Assistant Lecturer in the area of Food Ingredients and Food Chemistry in TU Dublin. Graham is also a Convene Enterprise Fellow. So Graham, over to yourself for the first question to our group here.
Thank you very much, Eleanor, and thank you for all the fantastic conversation today, and for the opportunity to ask a question. I might actually ask the question to JC. I actually know JC very well, but we haven't discussed this in advance, I promise. As somebody who's more junior, and Suzi, you made reference to junior and senior academics. As a junior academic, I've recently been through the teaching and learning training and certificate, and there was reasonable reference made to the sage on the stage, and JC, you made reference to that you can't be all-knowing, that you can't be that sage on the stage anymore. And I was just wondering, how do you see your role now? Is it one of a facilitator that's about helping to bring out the best in the student? And I suppose as a lead on to that, then I just wonder, does that role change in the online versus the on-campus learning environment?
Yeah. You can still be the sage on the stage, and I think some colleagues still are reluctant to step down that pedestal, and it's an attitude you have at the bottom of a theater. The classroom is not architecturally made for facilitators and guides. They're designed from 19th century onwards as you facing them. So there is a dichotomy there. The online experience is completely different. What I see on my screen here are equals. So I'm even as the classic teacher, whatever. I am on the same postage stamp as they all are, and I think it's a great equalizer. Online teaching for me for the last 2 years has been great. It facilitated the transition towards a guide and advisor, because you're on the same stage as them. We're all facing the same direction. We all face each other. So it actually was a big help, was a big aid.
Thank you. Thank you, JC. I see, Michaela, I see you on screen. If you're able to come in, I want to invite you in because we've had a great discussion in the past weeks about your fellowship. I've learned a lot more about the space industry than I thought I would joining the Innovation Academy. So I see one of our colleagues in the chat, David Johnson, has asked about risk. Now, he may not have meant in the way that you have interpreted it, but risk has been a central part of your fellowship. Can you talk a little bit about how you addressed it and what you found?
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Yeah, so basically, as a radioc, I was interested in risk. So I made links with the space station and aviation, because many years ago I started to train to be a private pilot. And what I'm interested in is something called the human factor. So my issue was the space industry, the aviation industry, and the health industry are all big, large organizations. And they all take lots of different groups of people whose focus might be different, like the engineer that puts the bolt into the particular platform that the rocket launches from, or the person that gets the patient changed for the radiographic examination or something like that, or the pilot. Everybody has slightly different roles, but they all work to the common good, whether it's launching a plane, maintaining the International Space Station, or diagnosing and treating a patient. And so I was looking at what's called either critical incidents or the human factor, where things go wrong, and how as humans we can try and reduce that. So in the aviation and the space industry, they have something called redundancy. We don't really have that in healthcare. And so I was sort of looking at that and seeing if there was anything that was actually transferable from these large organizations, because it tends to be when something goes wrong in healthcare, and I'm not sort of out to pick on particular people, but one of the responses tends to be this was a system failure. And we don't really get that in the space industry or the aviation industry. They pinpoint it very exactly in terms of, third bolt on the second panel was not incorrectly, so it gave a false reading, and this led to A, B, and C. So that's how I was looking at risk in terms of how you could actually minimize risk if you ever can. And I had a discussion with someone from the World Health Organization, and they made a very valid point in terms of patient risk. And they were saying, well, in the space industry, in the aviation industry, if the pilot or the astronaut gets it wrong, they're personally invested in this, and they go down or explode with the ship. In the healthcare industry, often the surgeon or the doctor walks away, and it's the patient that occasionally doesn't. So I don't know if that answers the question that the person raised on risk.
I think it's possibly a different perspective, but I think one worth hearing. And I know that we'll be publishing an article later this week by you that brings that comparison that you've made to life, and a really fascinating one. There's a question in the chat from Alan Morgan, who is very invested in education and creativity and innovation. Never one to miss an opportunity. Alan, he has a question for you, Deirdre. Could an outcome of this project be the development of a curriculum between both of us, between the Innovation Academy and the School of Education, to continue this work with teachers? So, I mean, Deirdre, don't feel put on the spot to answer that specifically now, but I think the broader point as well, about collaboration and the merits of that. I'd be glad to hear your reflections on that too.
Yeah, thanks, Eleanor. I think I think Suzi mentioned this earlier, I think one of the really positive outcomes for me has been those connections with, the Innovation Academy, with Alan, with Joe, with Kate, with lots of colleagues through the Innovation Academy, in terms of, collaborations and thinking about how we can develop our work. One of the things that struck me listening to everyone this morning, and something I'm always really fascinated by, are the ripple impacts of our work. So we're all standing in whatever virtual room or physical room in our teaching at the moment, and we're engaging with students who then go on out into the system as practitioners, or in whatever way they go into our society. And then they bring their learning with them into their role, and that's pretty profound for me, because I'm educating educators. So, you know, we're talking about education at third level, but of course, all of this really starts when a child comes into an early childhood setting or into a primary school or a post-primary school, and we set the scene for them around creativity. And one of the things that has happened in the past year is the Teaching Council have actually put creativity as a really core aspect for any initial teacher education programme now being developed or being reaccredited across the country. So, you know, it's going to become a priority in terms of our education system at primary and post-primary level. And I think the ripple impacts of what we do in our lecture theatres, in our classrooms, in taking risks, you know, and I think the question around risk is give an example of that. I think, you know, making a space for students at the start of your lecture, giving 10 minutes, this is what I would have done, taking 5 or 10 minutes just to try something different. For me, it was around well-being and giving 5 minutes just to tap into student well-being and give them time just to, I suppose, stop and breathe before we start into the content of curriculum as I teach in my teaching. And I think taking those risks and demonstrating that and role modeling that, and again, we've heard that this morning, and giving an invitation to students. And I think that's real key. And I think the Innovation Academy are brilliant at that. It's this innovation or invitation to creativity. And I think that's a really important aspect of anything that we do in the future, is giving an invitation to, as JC called it, the journey, a journey in creativity, a journey in vulnerability, a journey in risk-taking, where the possibilities for me are limitless and they're transformative. They're transformative for their individual, they're transformative for our programs, but they're also transformative for our society. So yeah, I'm open to any collaborations.
That's a yes, Alan. That's a firm yes. Thank you, Deirdre. I'll bring in a question from Circa Highland from TU Dublin, and then I think we'll go to Coleman. So Circa asks, how might democratic principles play out in terms of participatory learning in the online space? What benefits might visual arts and multimedia offer, particularly in mentoring spaces? Joe, I'm looking at you and I'm thinking of podcasts. I'm going to draw on you, and maybe you have some reflections on the multimedia dimension of that question.
Oh my goodness. Great question, Saoirse. I don't know about democratic principles, but certainly visual arts and multimedia. I think one of the things that I did when I was doing my diploma in entrepreneurial learning with Alan and the IA team was I also did the digital badge, the UDL, digital badge, Universal Design for Learning. And one of the eye-opening things for me when I did the digital badge, which turned into the name of the podcast that I'm now kind of hosting, which is +1 Learning, was this idea of different ways of expressing your learning, your learning journey. And as educators, and I'm completely with JC on this, that you know, rather than being sages on stage now, we should be Sherpas, facilitators, helping the people that come to us for learning to co-create a learning journey where we haven't got all the answers, but maybe with our experience of going through these learning journeys with other cohorts, we can help them along the way. But we're also discovering along the way as well. And one of the key ways of doing that, I think, that comes out of, you know, a lot of the innovative education work that's been done in the last 10, 20 years, and even going back to Freire and Froebel and, you know, whatever, is multiplicity of expression. Don't just ask everybody to write a Word document or a report or whatever. Yeah, get them to, you know, make a video. Get them to create an art piece. Get them to do a poem. You know, Jacob is brilliant at this, the improv stuff, you know, or whatever, and that opens up doors. That opens up doors in people's heads. That opens up creative doors. And when you open up doors in people's heads, you start making unexpected connections. And that for me is absolutely essential if we're moving into this creative educational space. And yeah, I understand, you know, Justin's point that there's certain stuff we have to cover. And we can't play all the time, and you know, there needs to be a level of attainment, if you like, of knowledge and of capability in various disciplines that you're taught. But if I've learned anything from the Innovation Academy over the last 2 or 3 years, it's that you can learn in different ways, and we don't just have to learn in the old ways. Yeah, and we can attain new levels of capability by experimenting, by failing, by being allowed to fail. And not being penalized for failure, but having actually failure celebrated. Well, that was great. You tried it and you crashed and burned. Okay, now what have you learned? Yeah, what are you going to do differently next time? So I think the multimedia arts, visual arts, multiplicity of expression thing is a fundamentally important space that we should all be learning in.
Great, thank you, Joe. Just a final question that I will throw out to the floor before I hand to Suzi to close. Many of you have spoken in our weekly meetups about creating the conditions for change. We've reflected a lot here on, ourselves and what we do with our practice and our teaching, but equally the importance of creating the right conditions for innovation and creativity with our colleagues. We've reflected on doing so with our students here. I wonder if any of you could share some closing thoughts on that and what you've drawn from this experience on that theme. Justin, I've seen you first, so I'll call you in if you have any thoughts on that. Creating the conditions for creativity and innovation.
Well, I have many thoughts on that. I think the most important thing when it comes to, and this comes from a legal copyright perspective, creativity is making sure that there aren't many barriers in terms of times, in terms of resources, and this is luxury that we have here at UCD. That we do have the time, and I always see when I look at my colleagues in other countries. I was just observing a chap who was applying for a professorship in Hungary. The amount of time he has to spend simply on admin. He does his teaching by the textbook because there simply is no physical room, time, space to do this. But there's also an encrusted pedagogical notion in certain countries that I encountered in Hungary. Don't get me started about places like Russia or other countries I don't want to name drop here. It's the institutional mindset that allows you. And I think UCD is great in enabling us to take time off, but also to have the liberty to experiment. And even here in the law school, in principle, I can do whatever I want to. Quite frankly, nobody will probably check what I'm doing unless I do something shocking that offends people, which I do sometimes on the substance, but this is what we do when we talk freedom of expression. But it's the institutional setup that enables us to do that. And when we talk about democratic participation, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, there are certain elements that where we have a very, very good advantage, and we can play with a number of things, be creative and be experimental. I also think that it is really a question of character and experience that you have to somehow mature into a role where you dare certain things on the academic floor. I would never advise a person who has his or first academic position to say, try anything you want, because that might horribly backfire. Because there might be deficiencies in substantive knowledge and so on and so forth. But it's certainly a process in which you have to grow into. And I think my advice with most junior scholars, once you're comfortable with having taught 1 or 2 years, do it bit by bit and really work your way into a mindset that enables you to go bit by bit beyond the borders. And after a few years, you can do a great leap every now and then. And if you land in the water, you have to swim back to the shore. That's fair enough. But it's really a question of the institutional setup. And again, we're in the very luxurious position here at UCD to be able to have that. And yeah, it's a growing process that everybody needs to say for him or herself, depending on the school they're working in, the career stage. I can do this. I want to do this. But I also appreciate that there will always be people who say, I'm very, very insecure and I want to do the standard program. I have nothing against that. I do understand it can be boring for the students, but it's really an individual choice, I would say.
Thank you, Justin. Michaela, for a closing thought, and then we'll hand it to Suzi. Michaela.
Thank you. So for me, it would be setting the right culture where, think the impossible. But also, I think as well as professionals, we need to think outside of our own little professional box. So for example, like with my project, I sort of looked at things from a perspective of aviation and the space industry. And if you look now with the clinical risk factors and things, like there's big companies like British Airways that are doing human factor training, at like Heathrow Airport with healthcare professionals. So I think it's like draw from other agencies and raise your head from your own professional for it.
Thank you, Michaela. Lovely thought to end on. Suzi, over to you.
Great. Well, it's been a really great conversation on the lawn. If we think back to where we started and the nascent seeds that were planted in November 2019, that was pre-pandemic. Nobody had imagined that we would be in the situation that we're in now. So we're seeing, increasingly these curveballs that nobody expects, and that we expect all our students and staff to miraculously adapt to. So I think it's really highlighted the importance of what we're all trying to do, and that we're only going to achieve it together. It's very hard for anybody individually to cope with the level of disruption and change that we're facing into at the moment. And I think particularly the partnership and peer-to-peer approach with students will build capacity in our community, our society. So thank you, every one of you, for the time that you've invested. And I know many of you have worked harder during the fellowship than maybe you would have done with a standard trimester. So I really appreciate all the time that you spent to make a better experience for our students, and looking forward to many more fellows in the future. I know there's a very strong theme of the fellows who've participated this year wanting to come back and support the fellows in future years. And I think that's a really positive outcome of the fellowship. So very grateful to the HEA and Convene for making this possible, and looking forward to the next event like this, which will be the TU Fellows, and definitely more plans in place to bring together the fellowships across the two institutions, and all the synergies and new ideas that will generate. So thank you again to Eleanor and Jake and Kat and Graham for joining us and making this possible today. And thank you for everybody who's been in attendance.